For the last few years, under the new Middle East plan, after the failure of the so-called Greater Middle East Project, the U.S. has been trying to disintegrate the region's countries according to ethnic and religious backgrounds. The U.S. claims that after World War I and II, the countries in the region did not take ethnic and religious considerations into account, and ethnic groups and religions in the region were divided between the newly established states, and their rights have frequently been infringed. The U.S. says that while deliberately neglecting that this is the hegemonic power of the day that set those boundaries to serve its colonial interests. And the savior, ironically being the U.S. in this equation, came along with a white horse, a gray F-15, to save the day. Nevertheless, the hegemonic U.S. power, again considering its current goals and interests, attempts to hatch its new plot for the region, hitting Iraq again. However, why does the U.S. seek to disintegrate Iraq? A look at events in Iraq after the U.S. invasion in 2003 highlights the fact that over the last 17 years, they have failed to achieve their ultimate goal, that is total domination over Iraq. After occupation of Iraq, in the course of forming the new Iraqi regime, the U.S. failed to implement its preferred model, and the process of establishing a new government in Iraq took away against what the U.S. desires. It brought about a Shia majority to power. This particularly prevented the U.S. serious intervention in major policies of Iraq. On the contrary, this made way for the main foe of the U.S. in the region, the Islamic Republic of Iran, which has had strong ties with the Shia groups in Iraq. These ties led to the creation of the Iraqi Popular Mobilization Units that eliminated Daesh and now imposes real threat to the U.S. illegal existence in Iraq. This has never been acceptable for the U.S., and that is why over the last years they make attempts to disrupt the existing political order in Iraq by trying to pressure division in the country. The U.S. has failed to reach its goals in an integrated Iraq in recent years and now seeks to divide Iraq. If they succeed, it would be much easier for them to further their interests in a small, poor, and a possibly dependent country. But will they really succeed? Welcome to the Mideastream. I'm Marwa Osman. The U.S. pushed into a corner by Iraqi calls to expel the U.S. occupying forces from their country is seeking to split Iraq into 3 separate sectarian regions in order to maintain its true presence in the region. By doing so, the U.S. is seeking to stir more hatred and conflict in Iraq in order to keep the country down. This allows the U.S. to keep its forces inside of Iraq simply by relocating them to elsewhere in the country, most probably into Iraqi Kurdistan. To discuss this issue with us from Beirut is Laith Marouf, political commentator. Thank you for being with us, Laith. Now, it seems that the U.S. is on track to kick off some sort of either an imminent threat or maybe an imminent war against Iraq, as U.S. Secretary Mike Pompeo shared hundreds of satellite images of maybe 80 specific sites of inside of Iraqi territories with Iraqi President Barham Saleh in such a show of force. Now, all the while, the U.S. seeks to divide the country, as we said, to 3 different sectarian regions. Do you think that this is some sort of a show of force by the U.S. only to maintain that division will be on the agenda, maybe on the top of the agenda list for the Iraqi government?
Well, this has been the plan by the United States and the imperial forces since even before 1990 war on Iraq. If you remember, the Kurdish separatist factions have been working with the apartheid Israel since the 1950s. Mm-hmm. There is, just like in Lebanon, 3 major groups: the Kurdish, the Sunni, the Shia. So there is not a clear majority of somebody that can rule. And therefore, the United States will play on these lines of division no matter what the case, because the ultimate goal is to divide Iraq, to divide most Arab countries to smaller and smaller segments that cannot be independent, cannot be sovereign or self-sufficient. And in this situation, a few years ago, there was an illegal referendum in Kurdistan that voted to separate from Iraq. And within few hours, we saw both the Iraqi army and the Iranian army surround all the entrances and exits to Iraqi Kurdistan, and ended that in its infancy. So we saw also ISIS being brought in to create a Sunni state in Iraq and Syria, and separate that from the south of Iraq, that is Shia and Kurdistan, Iraq. And that didn't work because of the defeat of ISIS at the hands of the resistance. Now we're coming back to a different version of it. So we will continue seeing these various versions of the separation plan of Iraq, no matter what and who's in charge. Even if it's a pro-American government that is in charge of Iraq, they will have to deal with this reality.
Well, Laith, there are already many rumors spreading that the U.S. is seeking to greatly increase its troop presence in the KRG-controlled region of Iraq, allowing them to de facto remain in Iraq and to have an area from which to strike the rest of the Iraqi territories. Now, how do you think this will play out in the term of breeding internal infighting between Iraqis of different ethnic backgrounds because of this move?
Well, it's a big problem, the way that the Kurdish leadership in Iraq is behaving. Most Iraqis, if they want to go to those regions of Iraq, they need the permit to enter their own land if they're not Kurdish. And we know that the oil is being smuggled out through Turkey, the supposed enemy of the Kurds. And no money is coming back to the central government of Iraq. So this region will be a problem for sovereignty in Iraq. The United States will use it as far as it can. That includes the possibility of war, where now we've seen the American troops withdraw mostly out of the rest of Iraq into Kurdistan, because then they feel that they're going to have some protection on the ground by the Peshmerga. So, and in the case of a conflict rising in Iraq, definitely Kurdistan, Iraq will be the battlefield, and they will be targeted there. We hope, some leadership in Kurdistan, Iraq will think about the safety of their population and how it's affected by being tools of the United States.
But the U.S. strategically views its presence in Iraq as being essential to countering maybe Iran and its allies. I'm speaking here basically about the axis of resistance that's working against Western hegemony in the region. Now, however, the local and regional retaliation against the assassination of both Lieutenant General Qasem Soleimani and Deputy Director of the Popular Mobilization Forces, Haj Abu Mahdi al-Muhandis, proves that the U.S. is facing a determined enemy here. Where do you see the situation they're headed to?
Well, we're all waiting for the elections in the United States to see if we're going to move into war very fast or in a slower pace, because ultimately the United States is an imperial power. It doesn't matter who's in charge, but in the end, there will be a confrontation. How it will happen, at what terms, will be dependent on who's in charge of the United States and also on the stakes on the ground. We know if there's going to be a direct confrontation, that means a disaster for American troops stationed across the Gulf.
So you mean whoever the president comes, the clashes or the confrontation is inevitable?
Definitely, it's inevitable. It just depends on if it's Trump, then we're going to go with the Wahhabi Zionist axis leading this fight, and if it's Biden, it will be the Ikhwani, Turkey, Qatar axis being mobilized again, as was in the time of Obama. So ultimately the war is coming. It just depends on who's in charge of the United States and what move that they will make, and which battlefield. Is it going to be Iraq? Is it going to be Lebanon? Is it going to be Syria that is going to have the firing shots that open up the battle?
Well, one should note that ethnic and religious sensitivity inside Iraq now is a pretext for the U.S., as it always has been, is what have been created thanks to the intelligence services of the U.S., the infiltrators and the affiliations in the region of West Asia, namely here the Israeli regime. However, this will prove to be a very serious problem for Iraqis and the Iraqi elite themselves. What do you think would be a viable start, maybe, to overcome this anticipated U.S. threat to ensure that sectarian violence in Iraq does not return?
Well, one of the problems that Iraq has been facing since the invasion and occupation is their inability to have a sovereign government that actually takes decisions without having people backstabbing it within the political structure. So ultimately, there has to be a winner's government. Just like here in Lebanon, we're having that same problem where if you continue to depend on national unity governments, that means everybody is in under this government, which means including the collaborators.
Which means no work is going to be done.
Exactly. So those who are in the resistance in Iraq and let's say in Lebanon need to actually take that step of taking control of the government because they have the numbers democratically to do so and move ahead. If they don't choose, then they are just delaying the inevitable, which is an internal clash instead of an external clash with the imperial forces. So, and this is what's very important right now, hearing Macron speak about Muslim separatism in France, where they have 20% of the population Muslim. Mm-hmm. I think about that every time somebody from the West talks about dividing Arab or Muslim countries into mm-hmm. ethnicities and sects. I'm like, why don't we do it also in Paris, where all the suburbs around Paris can become a state of themselves? You see, that's where the Pandora's box.
Definitely, because only divisions are made for the colonized, not the colonial powers. I want to thank you very much, Laith Maarouf, political commentator, for joining us to talk about what is next for Iraq in the midst of a continuing U.S. occupation. Please stay tuned next to talk about Yemen. The United Nations Children's Fund, UNICEF, in a controversial move, praised what it called Saudi Arabia's humanitarian role in Yemen, closing its eyes to years of atrocities committed by Riyadh and its allies against the civilian population there, leaving a large number of children dead, maimed, and malnourished. The move prompted immediate protests from human rights groups worldwide. UNICEF aids in smothering Yemen in this following report. The United Nations Children's Fund, UNICEF, in a controversial move, praised what it called Saudi Arabia's humanitarian role in Yemen, closing its eyes to years of atrocities committed by Riyadh and its allies against the civilian population there, leaving a large number of children dead, maimed, and malnourished. The Arab world's poorest state has been enduring a bloody Saudi-led war since 2015, heavily compounded by the world's largest cholera outbreak. The nation has been bombed ruthlessly by the Saudi-led coalition with backing government forces in their fight against the nation of Yemen. These extreme circumstances have had catastrophic results, and yet such shameful UNICEF statements continue to be proclaimed year after year. Serious violations of international humanitarian and human rights law are being committed with impunity. The Saudi-led coalition has conducted scores of unlawful airstrikes that have killed and injured thousands, targeting schools, markets, hospitals, and homes, while indiscriminately shelling civilian residential areas. What the executive director of the world body, Henrietta Fore, claimed in a letter sent to the so-called King Salman Humanitarian Aid and Relief Center, lauding Saudi Arabia over what she described as the kingdom kingdom's generous support for the projects of the United Nations Humanitarian Response Plan in Yemen 2020 is nothing short of an aiding hand in smothering the Yemeni population. What relief is the Yemeni people receiving if behind the biggest aid donors are the very facilitators of the war, a Western-backed Saudi bombing campaign accountable for the majority of damage being done while throwing in a couple of millions in support of the very mercenaries they recruited to destroy Yemen? Yemen needs no money. Yemen needs the war to stop. Arms sales to Saudi Arabia must be stopped immediately. Access to ports, land, sea, and air must be accessible for civilian and aid assistance mobility. And most importantly, the direct perpetrators and facilitators of this devastating human catastrophe should be held accountable. If action is not taken to stop the wave of atrocities, Yemen may reach a point of no return. Now, to discuss this issue with us from Sydney is Dr. Tim Anderson, author and academic. Thank you very much for joining us, Dr. Anderson. Now, Executive Director of UNICEF, Henrietta Fore, in a letter sent to the so-called King Salman Humanitarian Aid and Relief Center, lauded Saudi Arabia over what she described as the kingdom's generous support for the project of the UN Humanitarian Response Plan in Yemen 2020. I believe if the children of Yemen would hear that, they would throw their heads back in the air and laugh. But it is not something that's so funny because their little bones will hurt because of the malnourishment. What's your take on this letter?
Well, it's something that's been going on for the duration of this recent war, at least 5 years, that the Saudis have been funding the UN humanitarian agency, which is now distributing money to WHO and UNICEF and the others, very large amounts of money, between $500 million and $1 billion each year. And as a result, the Saudis have been taken off the list of those abusing children. They've been thanked, as you've outlined. So effectively, they're buying significant influence to muzzle the UN in terms of criticising what's going on with this war.
Well, the praise that the UNICEF actually sent out to Saudi Arabia follows a decision which you just spoke about right now, which is the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres. He issued a statement on June 15 of this year, removing the Saudi-led coalition engaged in an atrocious military campaign against Yemeni population, especially children. He removed them from a blacklist, which several years after it was first named and shamed for the killing and injuring of children in this impoverished Arab country. Look, I won't ask why. I'm not going to say why did they do this. I will ask how on earth does such world bodies do such a thing and maintain credibilities in the eyes of at least the devastated people of Yemen?
Well, the same thing happened with the previous Secretary General Ban Ki-moon. In 2016, the Saudis were also removed from the list of those abusing children, and also because they paid large amounts. They must be the largest funders, and by the way, the UAE is contributing with them through the King Salman Fund. They must be the largest funders for the UN for all of its operations in Yemen, basically, and that's why they have this terrible conflict of interest. I mean, how can they possibly be praising the very people who are not just engaged in the war and the bombing, but also the siege, the blockade, which has led to the starvation, the cholera, and so on. It's a terrible conflict of interest in the UN, and it should be brought to light much more.
Well, the issue is that the same people who are contributing to the aid are the same people who are actually destroying the Yemeni population. I mean, $100 million per day is being paid by the Saudis to destroy Yemen, yet how much money are they paying for this quote-unquote relief efforts? It doesn't even add up to being what is being paid per day on weaponry and on destroying the country. I mean, surely the world bodies, the UN, the UNICEF, they do see that, don't they?
They must see it. And in fact, I think there was some complaints coming out of the UN in 2016 about the pressure they were being subject to, but they didn't specify back there. Now we know that all across the UN agencies, the humanitarian agencies, this money has been rolling in. I'm not sure whether there's additional pressure, perhaps from the US, which of course is the mastermind of this dirty war on Yemen. But certainly the amount of money in terms of the UN budget is very, very large, basically, and it's helping sustain whatever UN operations they are. As you pointed out, the military spending is even more, but it's a terrible compromise. It's a terrible conflict. The UN's been caught with its pants down, really. It's a shocking scandal.
Well, let me give out here a couple of statistics for what's going on in Yemen. The war has pushed Yemen to the world's worst humanitarian crisis. We all know that. But the UN itself has verified 7,700 civilian deaths by March 2020 caused by direct Saudi coalition airstrikes on the country. Now, monitoring groups believe that the death toll is way higher than that. The US-based Armed Conflict Location and Event Data Project said in October 2019 that it had recorded more than 100,000 deaths, including 12,000 civilians killed in direct attacks. There must be a key that puts an end to the Yemeni suffering. What do you think that key is?
I think the key is this has to be turned around. Instead of the UN thanking the Saudis, there has to be tremendous pressure on the Saudis, who are in the front line, effectively the cat's paw of the US in this war. There has to be tremendous pressure on the Saudis for it to be made very clear it's completely unacceptable what they're doing. Unfortunately, instead, the UN is doing entirely the opposite. They're thanking them for humanitarian support. It's just bizarre. It's doublespeak, and that doublespeak has to be exposed and turned around so that there is tremendous pressure is brought to bear on Riyadh.
Well, but the people who tried to expose this are either not heard or they are imprisoned, and we have evidence of that, like many journalists who actually got in prison because they tried to expose that their governments in their Western countries were as much as killing the Yemenis as the Saudis were.
Yes, well, that indicates, of course, the countries, and they're the usual suspects in the Middle East: France, Britain, the US, the ones that are making a lot of weapons to the Saudis and to the UAE, making lots of money out of it. Of course, they, in some respects, have criticised the Saudis, but they themselves have remain more or less immune to that sort of criticism. They are in the background. They are driving. Really, perhaps more attention should be paid to the US and the UK and France, particularly the weapons that they're giving to the Saudis to attack Yemen and carry out all this carnage.
Well, Dr. Anderson, the United Nations has warned that the death toll from the coronavirus pandemic could exceed the combined toll of war, disease, and hunger over the last 5 years in Yemen. Now, this sentence by itself is a catastrophe that should have moved mountains, not only mainstream media, to push for an end for this really unnecessary war. Why is the mainstream media silent to that point?
They really don't care. They are the people behind these governments that are selling the weapons to these sorts of governments. And as you point out, the problem is, particularly when it comes to children, that malnutrition is a terrible mix with infectious disease, any sort of infectious disease. And so when the systems of adults and children are down, they're going to be hit with cholera, they're going to be hit with all sorts of infectious diseases. And so it's a terrible recipe for disaster there. But the people behind this, the media, of course, there are very few media in the world that are covering this, very, very, very few. And that's a scandal in itself too. These corporate medias are in fact the ones that are driving these wars. Let's remember, they're the ones that are given support to the US to carry out all of the wars across the region, including the war on Yemen.
Well, it killed me actually when we had the explosion in Beirut, and we had all this exposure from the mainstream media. Yet in 2015 there was a nuclear bomb that was dropped on Faj'atan. It was a new enhanced bomb used for the first time ever, and was being tested on the Yemenis in Faj'atan mountain, and no one said a word. That does it begins to say that it's an all-out atrocious and maybe it's being done on purpose by the mainstream media here.
Look, war these days is a combination of propaganda, economic war, and physical war. And so really the level of propaganda is so critical, so important. Look at all the lies that were told about Iraq, all the lies that were told about Syria. And of course, the silence about Yemen is entirely consistent with that type of propaganda war.
I want to thank you very much, Dr. Tim Anderson, author and academic, for joining us from Sydney to talk about the catastrophic situation in Yemen. Thank you very much for your contribution, and thank you for watching, and please stay tuned next week for more from the Mideastream.